Hello and welcome back to Living a Culture of Life podcast by Human Life International. I'm your host, Colleen, and I'm so excited to share today's episode with you. As promised last week, this is a conversation with Father Shenan Boquet, our president here at HLI, about Rerum Novarum and Catholic social teaching. Ever since Pope Leo XIV said that he chose the name Leo after Pope Leo XIII and referenced his encyclical Rerum Novarum, people have wondered what Rerum Novarum says and what Catholic social teaching is. On today's episode, Father Boquet discusses both of those topics and explains how Catholic social teaching centers around human dignity and the family, both of which obviously fit into a culture of life. Then we talk about how Pope Leo XIV might use those principles in addressing modern-day issues such as artificial intelligence. It's a really great episode. I enjoyed having it. It was a helpful review of Catholic social teaching for me, and I hope that you enjoy it as well. As a side note, I had some microphone issues during the episode, so my audio is a little bit more echoey than usual, but it should still be clear. And as always, if you have any ideas for future episodes, please let us know in the comment section. I would love to have podcast episodes talking about issues that you want to hear more about. And without further ado, please welcome Father Shenan Boquet to Living a Culture of Life. Welcome back to the podcast, Father.
Great to be with you, Colleen, as always.
It's great to have you here, and I'm excited for today's episode because we're going to be discussing Pope Leo XIII's document, Rerum Novarum. And obviously, our new Pope, Pope Leo XIV, has said that he chose the name Leo because of Pope Leo XIII and that he was hoping to use the principles in Rerum Novarum to be able to address a lot of the social issues that we see today, especially with artificial intelligence and just all the social problems that our world is facing. So I thought this would be a good time to take a moment to just look at Rerum Novarum and what it says, what Catholic social teaching says, and then how that applies to HLI's mission with promoting life and family around the world, because the two are very interconnected, obviously.
Awesome. Look forward to the conversation.
Yeah, let's just start with what was going on in 1891 when Leo XIII released Rerum Novarum. What was he responding to with that document?
So as you just beautifully gave it in the sense of, so Pope Leo is now looking out at the situations that are facing humanity. So we have the Industrial Revolution occurring. We have a shift in how demographics are in around the world and how that's impacting family life, individuals, society itself. What I mean by that is that as you have a shift in the Industrial Revolution from, in the sense of farming, agricultural, family-oriented communities, and people are shifting, migrating. So immigrant workers moving toward the cities or moving toward the industrial populations. So it creates a problem because now you have a really kind of an epoch change in the sense of how society looks at family, looks at the individual, looks at work, looks at how the role of the state, rights of individuals. All these are coming to bear, in a moment of time that is changing its approach. We have social systems like Marxism is rising in this moment of time. We have capitalism that's, occurring. So Pope Leo XIII is looking, at these situations and falling back, upon the perennial teaching of the church regarding the social teachings, the social doctrine of the church, and her principles that remain the same in every age. Yeah. How do we address these fundamental issues? And for Pope Leo XIII, the foundation is going to be the family. And then the first principle of the social doctrine is human dignity. It's understanding the human dignity and what does that mean. So I know we're going to talk more about that in detail, but these are the situations he's looking at. Yeah. And it's really something new. I mean, when you consider the fact of how families are being, kind of uplifted, moved away from the structures that had built society for so long, and that is families lived near each other, supported each other, but now you're having families literally pulling up root, moving toward the city. So you see these metro cities beginning to grow. And this all has social implications and moral implications.
Oh, exactly. When I had Dr. John Cuddeback on the podcast, he was talking about kind of the breakdown of the family that happens with the Industrial Revolution. All of a sudden, there's this wedge between husband and wife where the husband is either leaving home to go work outside the home in a factory, or you're moving away from your community where you have the family support. And so he, obviously, if you're interested in that episode, go back and listen to it. It was a great conversation. But he was talking about how there was kind of this wedge wedge between husband and wife, which kind of was helping facilitate the breakdown of the family that we see today, that kind of had its seeds in the Industrial Revolution.
And also how the state begins to perceive the family, how the state perceives the individual. We're looking at individual human rights. We're looking at the rights of children, families. All this is coming to bear, and it's not, again, something that is new. I mean, we've always had these debates and discussions, but when you have such a revolutionary thought, and our processes are changing, and demographics are changing, and the ways of approach are changing, in political systems and economic systems, which we're facing in the current day, which I know we will get to, why Pope Leo XIV, is addressing this already. But this is what Leo XIII is engaged in. And so he, as the shepherd of the universal church, is responding in Rerum Novarum.
Yeah. And the name Rerum Novarum means like of new things, basically referring to the technological advancements of that time and the social upheaval that was going on as well.
So, almost the modern day AI.
Yeah.
What was happening with technology, medical advancements and so forth and so on. So, but he's going to be very specific in what he's addressing. Yeah.
And let's just talk then about what Rerum Novarum itself actually says and like what are the key issues that Pope Leo XIII addressed.
I came prepared for that because it's a lot contained within the encyclical. I would encourage our listeners to really take the opportunity to read Rerum Novarum. And with that, I would encourage our readers also to read Centesimus Annus, which is the document by St. Pope John Paul II, 100 years in 1991, looking at Rerum Novarum, what the teaching brought to bear, but also how does that teaching now address in 1991? And you can see, again, how the church is looking. So I would really encourage our listeners, to take a time to reflect on these beautiful documents. So there are 9 that I'm going to mention, and not in great detail, just kind of throw them out there. We'll talk about some of them. So we're looking at the right of private property. We're looking at the right to form unions. This is a language that this was very new. The role of the state and the duty to intervene in order to protect the rights of individuals, to protect the rights of workers. The church has a duty, to help workers. Pope Leo is talking about this. The church's role, not only in the protection of individuals, but of workers, of families, but a role in society. A very important conversation Pope Leo has in Rerum Novarum. The family. Pope Leo XIII makes it very clear, is the foundation of society. Nothing new in the sense of teaching, but he's reminding society that, especially in this change of approach and the way that these economic systems and political systems are now beginning to change, that the family is still the fundamental unit that must be protected. The rights of the individual, particularly here the poor and the underprivileged, the vulnerable. And so he's going to make it very clear in Rerum Novarum, human dignity, which is the first principle of the social doctrine of the church, which I know we'll talk more about. We've done several times in our podcast. He also speaks about subsidiarity and also the principle of solidarity, these are those 3 fundamental principles of the social doctrine that Pope Benedict talked about many times, John Paul spoke about so often. And these are things that, again, we need to be reminded of in the current moment. So I know we're going to get to Pope Leo XIV, but there is no doubt in my mind that these 3 fundamental principles are going to guide him in how he approaches the current situations of technology, like AI.
Yeah. Can you just explain for our audience what the human dignity, subsidiarity, and solidarity
Absolutely.
are? Obviously, I think a lot of our listeners are familiar with human dignity, but subsidiarity and solidarity might be newer ones or ones that they've heard kind of in the conversation about social teaching, but never actually heard defined or explained.
There are so many people out there that have given different definitions, but I came today, so that I'm going to read them out, because I think it's important, because if we don't understand, as you just said, what those principles say and how those principles then are approached and how they apply to the various conversations. So we know human dignity. We clearly know that this is rooted in a correct understanding of the human person who is made in the image and likeness of God, whose dignity is not given by the state, whose dignity does not come by the amount of work or the amount of education. It is an inalienable and an inherent dignity, an unchangeable dignity. And it's a very important, even if a person falls into sin, obviously it affects the human person and the soul of that individual, but their dignity remains. This is something that cannot be lost. And we've talked about that many, many times in our
Yeah.
podcast. But here, if people are looking for something to read, they can go to the Catechism of the Catholic Church, number 1700. It'll help them to understand it.
But human dignity still is just like, obviously, we've talked about on the podcast a lot, it's the core reason that so many things, like even IVF, like the human dignity of all those tiny little embryos, they're just days old. Like, it's obviously something I'm sure our audience is familiar with, but like, I just don't want to just gloss over like the importance of it and the weight that it has of every single issue that we talk about.
And you can see how, especially as a person reads Rerum Novarum and addresses the rights of workers, how we speak to individuals with a proper right of wage. What's a just wage? Yeah. All this goes back to the human dignity, and recognizing the human person. And so as the Catholic bishops of the United States have made very clear in all of their documents that deal with human dignity is the issue that it's a moral vision. It's a proper vision of how we look at the human person and how that vision shapes our understanding of society and our response to the common good, which we'll talk about, I know, today. So when we're thinking about the principle of subsidiarity, this is one that often really confuses people. So subsidiarity is a prescriptive principle. So basically that informs how and at what level decisions should be made. So if we think about it this point, it fosters personal responsibility. You and I were talking about this before the podcast. And that personal responsibility is that proper understanding of the human person, there is a moral life that myself as an individual, as a man, is called to live, no different than you as a woman are called to live. And that this moral life that we are vision really reflects how we act, the decisions we make, but it doesn't just affect me individually. It affects how I approach society, how I approach other people. And so when we look at that principle of subsidiarity, we're looking at how my rights, my individual rights, and the rights that I have that should not be violated, but also how those rights affect other people. And so if I'm respecting other people's inalienable rights and recognizing their human dignity and their right to human flourishing, then we begin to build principles and laws and ways of governance that speak about the individual good, but also the common good. And so this is why the church speaks so in volume about, the assaults on human dignity, like with contraception, abortion, euthanasia, in vitro fertilization, human cloning, because it's just not an individual that's being affected or a human choice that's being made. It has a broader impact as well.
Did you say that was subsidiarity or solidarity?
Subsidiarity as well.
Isn't
because they link to each other.
The one that's like you deal with things at the proper level.
Right.
So like if there's an issue within a family, the proper place to like figure that out is within the family. Right. If there's an issue at a town level, it doesn't make sense to have the federal government deal with the town.
Right, but it also, it also deals with the fact of individual rights, individual human dignity, and the common good. So that's why subsidiarity and solidarity are so intimately linked.
Okay.
Because solidarity, when we look at the principle there, what we're dealing with here is the principle that, not only speaks about how my relationship is to other people and my concern for other people, my response in charity and goodness and kindness toward other human people. Yes, those are all applicable. But also, again, how do those decisions that I make, so back to subsidiarity, that affect my family. Again, I can't be self-centered only, right? I also have to consider how those decisions will affect the community around me, and then how the community in solidarity with each other, in response to each other, in respect to each other, then how they create principles and governance and policies that affect not only individuals, protecting individual human rights, but how does the broader picture of common good come into play? So this is why they're both linked so intimately to each other. They stand alone in principle, but they really are married to each other, and that's why you'll see them almost, in a sense, sometimes like on the wheel of justice. People will look at the social doctrine and they'll kind of see them in the same wedge. Oftentimes, it's because they're so intimately connected, and that's why Pope John Paul and Pope Benedict both, in referencing in their various encyclicals, apostolic exhortations, speak of the three of them: human dignity, subsidiarity, and solidarity. So for those, I think it's important, so you're right, that, levels of governance, levels of decision making. And again, why is that important? Because the state, does not exist for itself. The state exists, as Pope Benedict would speak of, and Pope Leo XIII speaks of, has an obligation toward individuals, the person, and has an obligation toward the common good. And so that's where that principle of subsidiarity now comes into play as well.
People don't exist for the sake of the state. The state exists for the sake of the people.
And the rights of the individual supersede the state. And so at the same time, there are always, reality of the common good. And this, always has to play in here too, but a proper understanding of the common good, needs to be talked about. And that's not what our podcast is about. We can spend the whole podcast on just these three principles. And we have done that before, but it's good for people to read. So if people are looking for it, I would go to Centesimus Annus, again, John Paul's document, paragraph 11. The Catechism of the Catholic Church, paragraph 1700, will begin to broaden those understandings.
One thing that struck me as we were preparing for this podcast, as I was reading through that, is just how much our society has lost both their human dignity and this idea of the common good. Especially, I think, as Americans, we struggle with this idea of the common good because it's kind of so much in our national identity of the individual and individualism, and that is good in a balanced sense, but it can't be individual at the expense of the common good.
Right.
But it was oh, go ahead.
No, please.
I was going to say, it struck me that with the sexual revolution, you end up in the area of sexual morality, kind of throwing out this idea of human dignity and the common good, because people were oh, well, contraceptive use in the bedroom, it's private, it doesn't affect the rest of the world. There's this idea of your sexual life not having social implications, and that's not true. And so if you are actually living, recognizing that you shouldn't be using people sexually, you shouldn't be using people physically, you need to respect the human dignity of preborn children and all of that. Obviously there's a huge element of human dignity wrapped up in sexual sin, but then also just this idea of your personal relationships do have social implications and common good implications. And so with the sexual revolution, people kind of rejected this idea of the need for common good with regards in the realm of sexual morality.
Right. And if we look at, Pope Leo XIV's, predecessor, Pope Francis, who really, the principle of solidarity was something very important to him. And we saw that in many ways that he addressed the human plight of our world. But he did not ignore the response towards subsidiarity. He always kept these three principles very much in play. And what's important for us is, they're standalone principles, but they're interwoven principles. And so that as we look at our response to our neighbor, all right, the common good, the common planet we live upon, and how we respond to each other as fellow citizens of this world, and how we have an obligation toward each other. At the same time, that does not, supersede, an individual right. And so how do you balance these, because these principles are not opposed to each other at all.
That was a little bit where I was trying to bring up this point about sexual morality as well, having being connected to the common good, because I think people hear solidarity and often think immigrants and caring for the poor, and this idea of it being through philanthropic and charitable means, and also that looking out for the common good is also how do my personal decisions and my personal relationships, that does have an effect on the common good. Right. And I don't know, having not anyone who is moral would ever do this, but having an OnlyFans account is hurting the common good. It's not just what you're putting on the internet. It's it's having this effect. So yeah, just trying to show that there's not this tension between people who want to stand up for sexual morality and pro-life issues and people who are concerned about social justice, that the principles of Catholic social teaching also guide the realm of sexual morality.
Yeah, they're consistent and constant. Mm-hmm. And also, if I may just use an example, just one of pornography. Mm-hmm. It's an example. Yeah. Someone says, well, I can utilize this in my own privacy. Well, first of all, you're dealing with other individuals. Yeah. Whether they're there of their own free will or being coerced. But again, you still have a usury. It has an effect upon society. It affects the mental health and spiritual health of society. The moral vision that we're talking about here, again, back to that moral vision of solidarity, subsidiarity, and the human dignity, gets lost in the whole industry of pornography, in the usury of human persons, and the misuse of the human faculties, the sexual faculties, begin to be abused and misused for not for that which God has designed. So these are things that come into all. That's why the church is speaking to all these issues, and many times people will see how it always relates back to the common good. You always see it because there always are implications and consequences to every moral decision that is made. And as moral agents, meaning actors, both of us, all of our listeners, we make decisions every day that not only impact ourselves as individuals, but have a impact upon the people around us. And so it's important that, as Pope Leo XIII is addressing, so because what are the rights of the individual for labor? What are the individual rights for a just wage? How does that affect the common good? How does migration of people from in more of a rural, agricultural, or family-oriented cultures that have been built around in towns and villages, now uprooting that? What kind of consequence that has, not only to the individual who's looking to better themselves and find work and find labor and find resource? How about the issue of private property that Pope Leo XIII brings up? What does that have to do? Why the state should not subvert the right to private property, and so all these things Leo XIII is addressing in his day, in his moment. Pope Leo XIV is going to address in the modern day.
Well, and obviously a lot of Rerum Novarum is focusing on like the rights of workers and private property and all of that. And I think it's just also important to recognize that like at the center of all that is human dignity in the family and these principles that we're talking about. And those principles apply to more situations than just like economic and like the economic social connections.
That's correct. And so just kind of punting toward the current moment, you can see, the same issues really still present. We still have within society a very utilitarian approach toward life, toward the human person. We see this not only in the moral issues of abortion and euthanasia, how we treat human people, but we can see it in how even modern science, through embryo stem cell research and, using human beings in their embryonic state for testing and for procedures and really denying the humanity of the child at its earliest stages of development. Or we can go to the end of life, to our elderly and those who are now under the burden of years being looked at as a burden to society, And so what are the obligations, in this modern day to those principles that are always objective and always true that Pope Leo XIII in 1891 was looking at, to what Pope Leo XIV in 2025 is now looking at?
I want to take a moment before we talk totally about the like modern era now. Can you talk a little bit about what Pope Leo XIII in Rerum Novarum said about a just wage and explaining that concept? Because I think that that's something that actually applies very much to our modern world, and I thought that was a really interesting point in Rerum Novarum.
Yeah, so what he's doing there, he's looking again, because we're dealing with the human person and in how the human person, because work is a good, providing for one's family, contributing not only for one's own personal good, but back to the common good, how this individual brings to the common good, brings to society their skills, their expertise, their labor, the contribution toward the good of society. And so he's looking at this and saying wages, I'm quote here from, Rerum Novarum, paragraph number 45, if people want to go back and read, wages ought not to be insufficient to support a frugal and well-behaved waged earner. So the idea here is that we have to look at that exploitation, given small wages, again, almost treating the human person as a machine, as a thing to be used within the cog of this work. And Pope Leo is speaking to this and saying that there is a balance between profit and the benefit of the owner of the company or the company itself, but not at the detriment to the human person. And to realize that should be a just and honorable wage. A person should give of themselves and provide work, in a sense, and that means give the laborer, the owner, a just day of labor, and at the same time the owner of the company or the one who is the provider to also give an honorable and just wage that allows the person to live in an honorable and respectful manner. And also now here we're dealing with individuals versus also people who are husbands.
That's what I wanted to kind of then shift towards, because he says in paragraph 13 that it is the most sacred law of nature that a father should provide food and all necessities for those whom he has begotten. And then he also talks later in the document about like a woman being naturally fitted to being like a mother in the home. Like he's not saying that women shouldn't work or anything like that, but kind of just that she's naturally suited towards that. And it does seem like with that, plus what he's saying about a just wage, that like a husband and a father should be paid enough to be able to provide for his family. Is that like a correct reading?
Yes, and I think again, and it's somewhat relative, but there are some objective principles that are there, and that is how does this is what I love. Now I'm stepping into quote modern times now. Yeah. It was a document that we spoke about many times in our podcast, and that is the vocation of the business leader. So looking at, that was just in 2012 when this document emerged. Okay. And so it was the first time that the church in a document began to address the business leader. So think about, so the business leader, owner, right, is a moral agent. And as an owner of a business, they're responsible for the moral good, to promote what is good. And so how do they approach the human person? So if their starting point is a moral vision that starts with human dignity, starts with an understanding of solidarity with the individual who is seeking employment and whose employment you need, and there's a benefit to both the person and to the owner. But if that moral vision is sound, it is virtuous, and it seeks the good and the well-being of the employee, right? And always governing the principles and policies and management with that in mind, starting with the human person, then we can see the good that will emerge. And we already see, I can give you many examples of companies in modern day. This is how they manage. This is how their vision is. And this is what's formed groups like Legatus in our current day, or in the Napa Institute that's looking at business leaders and people who have means within their businesses to shape society. So that's why it's not about just the individual. It's also looking at how the one who goes out, I think of scripture here, right? Goes out in the beginning of the day and hires his laborers for the day, offers them a just wage. People come at the end of the day. Now, I know it has many other meanings in sacred scripture, but think about just the fact that, the owner, and he says, are you envious of me because I'm generous? In other words, I will give, a just and honorable wage. I will give to each individual what is their right. And so this is something the owner of the business, and those involved in management always have to keep in mind. But then you turn it around, and also the individual who comes and brings a service has been employed to provide a work, a technology, a skill, also has to be just and giving the owner a just labor. And so, and absolutely, the idea of the father, and we know even in today, because of all the economic problems we see it.
And that was kind of where I wanted to kind of shift into, is that we've talked on this podcast before about the economic reasons that people choose, like we're in a birth rate crisis, and there's a lot of economic reasons that people choose not to have kids. And we've had podcasts on why the government isn't the solution to fixing that, but also in that discussing how people who are like, well, we can't afford another child, or it's expensive to raise kids, or there's like economic factors at play that are causing people to have small families or feel that welcoming a child is an impossible thing. And obviously there's a lot going on there, but it does seem that if people were to adhere to this principle of providing a just wage and also like being able to help a husband and a father be able to make enough money that he can feel free to welcome more children, that might be a solution to the birth rate crisis.
Yeah, and absolutely. And I'm glad you brought that up, because that is very, very important. I think that is where Pope Leo XIV is going to do addressing, because it cannot be ignored. We are in a demographic winter. We are in a moment of great concern in societies, especially in all of the Western world, where birth rate numbers are extremely low and very dangerous. And so the systemic reasons that are causing that. But if you look back to Leo XIII, these things are already being raised, not because of a demographic birth rate issue at the time, but the consequences. See, again, because we're looking at the common good, we're also looking at consequences of actions, consequences of economic policies, or economic principles, or ideologies, Marxism, capitalism. All these things have an impact, not just to individuals, but how they approach the common good, the well-being of society. And so here again, it's, what I remember in reading Centesimus Annus by John Paul II, and, always walking away with is this balance. I won't use the word tension. Some people but because it shouldn't be a tension. It should be a balance between profit and between benefit. So the person who is the one who created the technology has a right to benefit from their creation. At the same time, how does that person contribute to those that don't have access to that technology? And how does that benefit other societies? And that balance between, in a sense, a copyright language and also a profit, but also how much is too much profit? In a sense, those are questions that we're not going to answer today. But if I'm making a tremendous profit, but I'm not given an honorable and just wage to my employees who help try make the company and benefit the company to grow and to prosper, then my vision of the person is a thing to an end, a means to an end, and we should never treat the human person as a means to an end. So, and I think those things are very important, and even in today, especially in today's mechanized and industrial and technologically advanced societies.
Well, and it just occurred to me too that is kind of following the principle of subsidiarity. Because we've talked about how the government issuing economic incentives to have kids isn't necessarily going to be the solution. There's been governments around the world that have been trying that. It's sort of working, but not totally working. Right. But it does seem that if employers kind of recognize their responsibility in making sure that the individual is working for them or receiving enough to be able to care for a family, like that is a more proper place for this issue to kind of be worked out of like, okay, are there people that are working for me who feel like they either have to get a new job or can't welcome children with what I'm paying, and is there something I can do to help benefit that? Like, instead of having the government trying to fix it all at the government level, having employers be able to work individually with the individuals that are like working for them, figuring out like what are their needs and is this something I'm able to contribute to?
And the role of government, obviously is going to, is in each age is going to have different responsibilities as society matures, grows, and demographics change and so forth. But the role of the state, is not to subvert, and into burden, and to create policies and so forth that burden goes back now to our principle of subsidiarity, and so the role of the government is to support, to protect these principles, these core principles, this moral vision. But if I may put a little comma there, this is what I love about Rerum Novarum, because obviously it's not a new teaching, right? So it's a perennial teaching that's moving through each and every age. And so what Pope Leo XIII does, I think very beautifully, as you read the document in its whole, what is the role of the church? So the role of the church is not only to advocate principles, but even step a little further back, is to advocate that moral vision. So when we create through the teaching of the gospel, the proclamation of the gospel, the living out of the gospel, the living of the principles that come from the magisterial teaching, from sacred scripture, and so motivated by the Spirit of God in every age, is how do we, in a sense, form moral people, moral vision? So again, if my understanding of marriage is already tainted, if my understanding of marriage is not about an exclusive, indissoluble, fruitful union, all right, if that's been lost, then that's going to have some consequences going forward. So a moral vision is very important. And to me, that runs solidly through Rerum Novarum, as it does in all of our church's teaching, is that fundamental understanding of the human person and individuals and those and what human dignity means, and our response to the good. All right, God is the good. To live in accord with God's commands, then that changes how all of us approach. So this is why when you have other systems trying to literally subvert, supplant, deny, reject, God, and what we know are the moral principles that have passed through generations and millennia. And so Pope Leo is looking at this now in 1991, right?
1891.
I'm sorry, in 1891. And so 1991 is Pope John Paul II. He's looking at how the impact of the Industrial Revolution, how different ideologies now that are emerging, and he addresses Marxism directly. He addresses capitalism directly, right? And so he's looking at these ideologies either from an economic point, and he's looking at it from an ideological, philosophical point. And he is raising many questions, and he's also saying these are inappropriate. There are some aspects of it that are not acceptable. And so he's challenging them because these are, if allowed to mature, are going to have negative consequences to society. And if the state, which begins to assert itself in an inappropriate way, it violates not only the rights of individuals, but it violates the fundamental cell of society, the family. And so, and then that affects, that migrates forward because it affects labor. It affects the rights of individuals to have unions, to organize themselves, to defend their rights, to protect their rights. It also affects how wages are done. It affects the owning of private property. And we've seen this, right, under certain ideological systems where they literally steal property from individuals. They confiscate property. They take away a person's right to property. It's all the state. Well, no. So Pope Leo the 13th is addressing these straightforward, and so it's and as we start talking about Pope Leo the 14th, we can see how these things are still here.
Well, Pope Leo XIII was also addressing it before a lot of it had been tried. Right. Like before you had communist Russia and socialism really taking root, before you had, you could see the excesses of capitalism, I guess, at that point. But I was thinking specifically about Marxism and socialism. But I believe you were saying yesterday when we were discussing this that in his addressing all these social issues of the day, he really is centering on human dignity and then the family, and how those two are both at the center of how you respond to all these other social and economic issues, which is important.
Exactly, like with the business, the vocation of the business leader. Several of the paragraphs focus specifically on how the moral agent, which again, the business owner, how they approach their staff, their employees, and to realize that, and we have many, many stories where businesses have looked at the individual or maybe a program project as so important that it puts people in grave harm. It violates the safety and the regulations that should protect human life. Instead, they put human life at, again, as I said, as like a little cog. And so when that breaks, well, we'll take it out and we'll put a new one in.
Well, in a similar fashion, slightly different, but you also see with Planned Parenthood, their profit is the killing children. Their end goal is how can we make money? Right. And so you see this also when profit and money becomes people's main thing. You have an IVF industry that thrives off of so much money, but what they're providing is immoral. You have surrogacy. You have all of these businesses and industries in today's age that rely and get their profit from hurting or undermining the family and human dignity.
And here the state tragically has cooperated. Endorsed, supported. So these are the things. So I can almost imagine, Leo the 13th looking in 2025,
rolling over in his grave.
Well, just again, and I think this is what's so beautiful about Leo the 14th is looking through those eyes. He's looking through those lenses. And as I shared with you, in Eastertide, we have several moments when Leo the Great, Pope Leo I, is in the office of readings. And I imagine Cardinal Prevost, like every priest, religious, consecrated man and woman, looking at reading and praying with the church's liturgy hours, these things are speaking. They are living documents speaking in every age. And so when you pick up these documents of Leo the 13th, you can't help but look in 2025 and say, what does that still say to today? When you go back and you read, Centesimus Annus or Pope Benedict's, Caritatis in Veritate or Spe Salvi, or you start reading, some of the writings of Pope Francis. These all are speaking to these pivotal questions. And what is my obligation toward, to the individual and the common good? And because the end never justifies the means, that the technology, and this is where I think AI is going to be very, very important for Pope Leo XIV to address, because not all the technology is bad. It's a tool.
Yeah.
It's a question of how we use the tool.
Is it serving the human family and the human individual, or is it superseding that?
And we don't use, the human person is never a tool.
Yeah.
So this is where what you just wrote about Planned Parenthood, or the whole IVF industry, or the whole transgender industry that's out there today, and many others like them, that not only violate human dignity, in the human person, but they're violating, with that, what are the concerns to human society? So, like the contraceptive mentality, it's not just an individual impact.
That was the big one, that the common good being
That you
picked
talked about
up
earlier.
is just like this, like that's like that and porn are the two things that, like, the argument is like, it's individual. How is it like, it's my individual action? Why should you care? And it's like, but it does care, because like there's no private sin. Like the things like you do have, the actions that you have like make even in the privacy of your own bedroom do have an impact on the common good. And that when you lose sight of that and you think that you're living just for yourself, or just through this individualistic lens, and you lose sight of your duties towards the common good, that's when you end up with a lot of undermining. And one thing that he said in Rerum Novarum that really stood out to me, because this is something we've talked about on the podcast before, was the line, "Now when a state chiefly prospers and thrives through moral rule, well-regulated family life." And just that idea that the family is the cell of society, and that fundamental cell. And like in our mission here at HLI, and trying to like restore the family and heal the family and bring back that culture of life, like that is ultimately part of the solution, if not the primary solution, to solving so many of the other societal issues. And also things like solidarity and subsidiarity. Like you first learn those principles within the family. You first learn to think about people outside yourself within the context of the family, when you have to learn to share with your siblings. And like when you restore the family and heal the family and kind of can bring that back, that's how you start kind of having these ripple effects in outer society.
And it's interesting. I was just sharing this story just recently. I have some very dear friends that are business owners, and that on many occasions could have been bought out, made tremendous profit. But they chose, because they believed, not only loved what they did and loved the work that they actually created and built, but they believe in employing people. They want to support families, and they believe in it. And they could have walked away, and there was nothing sinful in doing that. But the idea is, but they saw something of a great importance, that they wanted to know what happens to the 2,000 people, what happens to the 3,000 people, what happens, to their families, where would they go find work, and someone could say, oh, but that doesn't concern you. But when you're praying and you're participating in daily mass, you're growing in your faith, you realize that it's not just me. It's not just about me. It's not me being able to go sit down and just be comfortable, right? It's also, what is my role toward my neighbor? What is my obligation toward my neighbor? Am I just to be able, as Pope Leo XIII brings up very beautifully, it's not just for the sake of profit. This is his conversation about Leo XIII about capitalism. It's not just about profit. And so we're talking about human beings. We're talking about, and so as this conversation, and so what I pulled up was the role of the state from Rerum Novarum. And he says, the state has a fundamental duty, one, to uphold justice, to protect the right of its citizens, especially the poor and the vulnerable. But then he moves the conversation to the role of protecting the family. But he says this role of the state has limits. So let's fast forward to 2025. Pope Leo XIV, this is something that no doubt has to be addressed. John Paul addressed it, Benedict addressed it, Pope Francis addressed it, and it still has to be addressed in the fact that the state around the world has not respected its limit and not respected its role. And so it's actually violating its role by violating the individuals they're meant to serve. And so this is something very important. He says the state must not overreach by stripping individuals and communities, that solidarity, subsidiarity, of their rightful responsibilities or freedoms, such as private property. So you're thinking about this. And so today, let's go back to economic. Yeah. Depending where you live in the country of the United States, an acre of land can cost something very reasonable to something astronomically out of reach. Again, and people say, oh, it's a matter where you live, and it's always a location. But why don't we pause and ask, how does this, are there any violations in this? Is the issue, how does it become inaccessible to the majority of the population? Or how do we create sizable debt that people are in our country, in constant debt, maybe born into debt, die in debt because they are just constantly working to pay off loans and interest rates and so forth. So profit, comes to bear. And, but how about creating opportunity for people to have ownership of a home, ownership of property? These things are very, very important. And not because we worship a thing, but there's something, again, the laborer deserves his just wage, back to Rerum Novarum. But the idea of being able to take pride in one's work, pride in one's ownership. Think of the violation we have in sacred scripture, where property was violated, where, someone went in and took because the person was vulnerable and poor and violated that property, and actually, in some cases, killed the individual in order to obtain the property. So obviously, these are violations of human dignity, and they're violations of many principles, but it's still happening today, right? And so you think about, back to economic issues, the cost of insurance, to insure one's property. It's a business. I mean, insurance companies are there to make money, all right? And so this is a question. How much is too much? Why are we paying so astronomically high fees for car insurance, home insurance, medical insurance? People are insurance debt. In debt, these are the kinds of things that need to be addressed. Now, are Africans dealing with that in some way? Are people in the developing world dealing with some of the same things that in the West? There are, but not to the same degree. But these are the kinds of things. That's why the church's principle is not arbitrary. It's not about the West. It's not just about the developing world. It involves everyone.
And the principles that then will apply in different
Right.
ways in different specific situations.
Right.
But what do you think some of the principles in Rerum Novarum that you think Pope Leo XIV is now going to latch onto to address some of the modern ones? So we already talked about the just wage possibility. Is there anything else that kind of stands out to you that you think he's going to really latch onto?
I think what we've been talking about consistently is the family. He's already, I was there for the Regina Coeli on his first moment when to lead us in the Regina Coeli, and he had talked to the youth. And one of the beautiful quotes to the youth was, "Do not be afraid of the invitation of the church and of Christ." He spoke about the family, and he's been very much speaking on the family. So I really think that these are going to be very important, to Pope Leo XIV, as it should be to the church. And that is, in every place around our world, the family is under assault. And so, as we've been talking about migrant workers, we have a huge, amount of people around our world because of exploitation, because of governmental corruption, because of a lack of economic ability to support themselves, a lack of just wage, are forced to leave their own country. As you talked about earlier, in 1891, leave your wife, leave your children, because you cannot find a just and honorable wage. You cannot find work where you are. So they leave. But what are the possibility of negative consequences? First of all, it separates a husband from his wife and his children for moments of time, or maybe for extended periods of time. How does that affect the family? Right? Is something honorable in it? Absolutely. And Saint Padre Pio's father did that to support his son to go to the seminary. So there are virtuous things involved in this, but at the same time, there are many consequences to it, and I've seen it with my own eyes in various countries, right? So this is going to be something. So not just talking about immigration, all right, and people immigrating. That's a different subject. Many things to be addressed. The migrant worker, right? Why are people leaving the Philippines, India, Africa? All right, in a sense, to look for work in the Western world because they're not finding it where they are.
So how can you help support having like those meaningful jobs right where you are instead of feeling like you have to go to a different country?
Back to the role of the state.
Well, I think that also is going to start applying with AI as well, as like lots of jobs like will begin likely to be taken over by artificial intelligence, or like people like kind of have their job usurped or taken away or start I don't know, like either having to collaborate more and more and more with robots or just losing their jobs entirely. As you have that, it's like, what is meaningful work? How can you help people have meaningful work and have something that they're actually producing something good for society? Because even if you have enough money and leisure, you're not necessarily being fulfilled like you need to be through work.
And also just the idea of we here in the States and in many countries, 8-hour workdays are pretty much a normal thing that people see. You have 12-hour workdays in the medical field, and you have 12-hour workdays in many industries, But the idea is, back to Leo XIII, this is something he addressed. But the idea of having, unions or being able to build, societies among the workers to be able to address, working environments, safety environments, making sure that, people are safe, making sure that they're, we're not creating sweatshops or just working people just to the end of the day and, and people having health issues and being used. These are still things today, that need to be addressed.
And that is actually one of the things that you will see AI and robots becoming a benefit for, is that you have a lot of, you could possibly, is that there are a lot of like factories that are kind of sweatshops right now. And so as you, like, there may be a way in which robots can be used to do these kind of mindless tasks that aren't actually fulfilling, so that people can then, if people are intentional about structuring society this way, go and have meaningful jobs and allow the kind of mindless factory robotic jobs that are done in sweatshops to be done by machines. So like there is a way that you can work with technology to make sure that people actually have meaningful work and that you don't have sweatshops, is what I'm trying to get at.
But also back to the profit side, that's that thing that all fits in. But I mean, obviously you could have, the use of technology, which we do have today, where to protect human life, a robot is sent into a place where there's bombs or fires or gas leaks. So we already are using this kind of technology because we value the human person. So, but again, there's always this little tendency, to creep in, and these are the things we're dealing with in modern society. So you talked about some of them on a different level, and that would be the issues like of surrogacy. The issue of IVF or, of the whole research industry using human subjects in order, or violating human rights in order to obtain an end. These are things that are going to need to be addressed as well, and are being addressed already. So it's not like something new that needs to be addressed. I do believe that, part of the Pope Leo XIV will confront is our non-governmental organizations like the United Nations, that actually are using, their means and their abilities to promote ideologies and behaviors that are not in line, with human dignity and the principles that we uphold. We know that, as you mentioned not long ago in another podcast, that AI is even being used, to advocate, through the United Nations and other industries to push their ideologies and agendas and use technology, in marketing and so forth and communications. And so, there, if I may say, Pope Leo XIV will not be bored to address the various issues of modern society. But if I go back to these those key principles, that are key lessons, if I may say, from Rerum Novarum, I can see Pope Leo XIV picking up those same key lessons. How does he address, the issue of capitalism and other economic systems today, and how are they at the service of human flourishing? Or are their means, or their ends different? I can see him addressing that. We can still look at Marxism today in many countries that violate human dignity. Matter of fact, we just had to postpone one of our missions into Latin America because of a political system and the dangers that are in that country. So there are modern day problems that are still with us, right? And so the idea today of from a different point, we know that some of the right to form unions and so forth, but we also know that not everything is ideal within those systems, where individual rights are all of a sudden, ignored. So there are many things could be addressed. The role of the state. I can see him really speaking. What is the role of the state? What are the role of politicians? What's the role of government? And you can see him also, one of the key lessons, re-articulating why the church is involved. Some people like to say, like you said earlier, but on differently, it's my choice. I'm an individual. I can do what I want. It's in my room, privacy, blah, 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 blah. well, what's the church involved? Why she's out there? Pope Leo XIII made it clear why the church is involved. I can again see Pope Leo XIV reasserting why the church is involved and why her role and her responsibility to advocate for the human person and to advocate for those core principles that speak in every age to every person and to every situation. I can see him reasserting that, especially as the Western world tries to squeeze out the church, and squeeze out religion and squeeze out, religious leaders from the impact on society. And as we know, that is an ideology that really fits into some of these things that Pope Leo XIII was dealing with. Pushing the church out of the conversation. You stay within your realm and not within our realm. Well, I can see Pope Leo XIV again addressing this. I can see him very clearly addressing the vulnerable and the poor. The idea that the world continues, to exploit the vulnerable and not reach out to the need of the vulnerable. Again, here I think of Sanctissimus Annus John Paul II in 1991, speaking then of the technology of that age. You're thinking today, having been on medical missions, thinking of how the benefit of our technology can help people in other parts of the world that have no benefit to that technology. How do we share technology? How do we share, these things that help human persons to flourish and not take over and not take their in a sense of going into an area and exploit them. We offer them technology, we offer them benefit, but then we want to exploit their land, exploit their resources, exploit their people. This is not, this is what Pope Benedict and Pope John Paul, Pope Francis condemned outright, constantly, and it's still happening. So Pope Leo XIV is going to be addressing this. Right? And I definitely can see, so that's that principle of solidarity, but also that principle of subsidiarity. How do we bring a technology in? And if I may, I'm going to use an example without mentioning the country. I was present in a meeting with some country leaders, and they were talking about a recent resource that they only learned that they had: oil. They never knew that they had oil within their boundaries of their own country. They suspected it, but didn't have the technology to be able to see if they did. Well, they were able to learn, but they didn't have the technology to be able to remove the resource and to process that resource and then begin to benefit from it. So all of a sudden, Western countries start coming in and start offering all these things. We can help you. We can benefit you. We'll bring you technology, all these things, but at what cost? And so at the end, at least when I was present, the conversation was, until we can learn ourselves, it's our resource, it would benefit our people. And of course, temptation is temptation, and we know that it's out there. But that to me is an example, doesn't mean that others could not benefit by bringing their technology and bringing their skill, but it needs to be just, and respect other people. And so how do we help people to have the technology they need for their human flourishing, to be able to grow? Subsidiarity, So these are all things, like I said, Pope Leo can be up 23 hours a day, and he'll have a plethora of things to discuss. He will not be bored in this ability. I think the last thing I would say on that is is advocating. I think, for example, Pope Francis so beautifully raised this constantly, is our elderly. So not talking about euthanasia, not talking about on that level at all, but talking about how if I were 75, why all of a sudden am I no longer useful in society's understanding? This is wrong. So again, we're also discriminating against people at the beginning of life, at the end of life, Colleen. And I think these are the things that I believe Pope Leo will continue to speak about, building on what Pope Francis said before in this regard, and taking it and moving it forward. And so again, thinking of the human person, the family as the fundamental cell. How does human dignity shape our moral vision? How then do we address the the technological advancements of our day, not only in technology, in mechanization, industrialization, but in medicine. How do we address these issues? How do we recognize that we still have poverty in this world? And how do we address that we still have ideological, philosophical systems that violate human persons and do not respect them? We still have all this present in front of us. So I'm confident that Pope Leo, who chose the name Leo, keenly aware of all of this. So our little podcast would not tell Pope Leo anything new, but I think for our audience to realize that our Holy Father did not choose his name haphazardly, that he gave this much thought. And I believe that what he is picking up, not just the Leo XIII, Leo I, all the way to Leo XIII, all of the Leos addressed modern issues, modern dilemmas, difficulties affecting humanity at the age in which they lived. And Pope Leo XIII, looking at this industrial revolution and the rise of other ideological revolutions that were emerging, that he wanted to get ahead of, and he did. He got ahead of the game in a sense of articulating, and others would follow. So I'm like I said, I know we haven't done full justice to Rerum Novarum, but it's such a beautiful document. It's a lengthy document, and I just would encourage our readers, Colleen, to take advantage of it. To really see what the Church taught, teaches, and where our current Holy Father, under the name Leo, may lead us.
Well, I'm really glad that we had this conversation, and I think it was helpful because I think sometimes there can be this kind of disconnect sometimes where people think about like the pro-life Catholics and the social justice Catholics, and like the pro-life Catholics don't fully understand Catholic social teaching and how it fits into like also defending life and family, when in reality, like Catholic social teaching flows from an understanding of human dignity and the family, and that like an authentic view of Catholic social teaching isn't opposed to the principles that we hold here, like the culture of life that we hold dear here. It's like the two, they go together and they flow from one another. And so I'm really glad that we had a chance to kind of have this conversation to talk about Catholic social teaching and what our new Pope will hopefully address, and then also show how it fits into like a culture of life.
I think what's going to be important, if I may just make one little last comment on this, is this is not about cafeteriaism. It's when I look at the wheel of justice, for example, that I've spoken of, several times, and you look at how the wheel of justice speaks, human dignity is always at the hub of the wheel, right? And so as we start addressing, for example, option for the poor, role toward community, the solidarity with the poor and so forth, it's sort of working our way through the wheel. But the idea is that they all hub to the middle, and so. I think the danger for us, even within the pro-life movement, sometimes we can attempt to kind of just isolate ourselves to one principle or to two that kind of fit where we are, but we fail to realize it's in the whole.
Yeah,
it's not meant to be segmented. We might show it as a segment in a way, but it's not to be segmented, and so it's not it's not that we're on two different. In a sense of apostolic works, we are on a single work, and it's important for people to say. So I'm glad you bring that up, because it is something that that's out there. I mean, I've seen it in parish ministry, where some people gravitate toward one aspect, feeding the poor, beautiful, absolutely wonderful, but ignore other key elements of solidarity, and I think this is what always raised the ire of Pope Francis, right? I think this is why he would speak so strongly. Because it concerned him, and it should concern all of us. And I think as pastors, especially our bishops, I know this is something key, to their concern, to the pastors in the parishes, and to the men and women working in those parishes and serving. It has to be something in us, and I know that it's something that was important to me. That when I was in parish ministry, to try to keep that balance and not just isolate one part of that wheel, if I may make reference to that.
Well, and I think that's where understanding the principles too is really helpful in kind of facilitating those conversations. Like when you understand, like, okay, people who are concerned about feeding the poor, it's like, okay, you're concerned about that, but it needs to be because you recognize like human dignity and then, okay, if you recognize human dignity, then that also applies over here to the abortion issue. And it can be a way to kind of bridge that seeming divide because they're all stemming from the same principles, or they should be.
Right.
And once you recognize that, you can kind of learn how to have that conversation and help show people like the fullness of Catholic social teaching instead of just the segment that they see or focus on.
And there are a hierarchy of values that oftentimes people forget.
Yeah.
But we don't have time for that right now. but it doesn't mean again that they're in opposition. You know, it just places a hierarchy that begins to help us understand. So back to it, and I'm going to close with this because I know we're getting too long in our little podcast today, but it's such a vibrant, beautiful discussion. But it's the idea that if I don't understand those fundamental issues, and that moral vision and where that moral vision comes from, then everything else below it just doesn't make sense. And as you said, it can almost become more philanthropic versus the fact that we're called to serve the gospel of life.
Yeah.
And that's why John Paul, spoke about the gospel and the gospel of life are not two different things. And so he was very, very clear that they are the same. And so how do we bring that moral vision into our parishes, into our society, and how do we bring that into the state? And one last thing with that would be, this I think is the biggest challenge, are our political leaders, our governmental leaders. Many admirable people doing yeoman's work for the good. But sadly, we do have many that cause great harm and do not promote the good of the individual or the good of society and mask their activities in falsehood. And this is something that Pope Leo XIV, no doubt, is going to also address.
Well, thank you so much for this conversation, Father. It's been
welcome.
Really interesting. I definitely studied Rerum Novarum in high school and have no memory of it whatsoever. So this was helpful to kind of bring that back up again for me and start thinking about how this applies to what we talk about here at HLI all the time. And I think hopefully it's helpful to our audience.
And maybe we can do one day, if you wish, Colleen, we can always, depending on maybe some of our audience can offer some feedback, would be maybe we can pick certain parts of it and just talk about certain aspects of it.
Yeah.
Because it is such a rich document. And we can also come into the modern times, if I may, 1991, and pick up Sentences Honest, pick it up, and then start picking up some of the other documents and maybe just kind of talk about certain subjects. But here, I think it's our audience that we want to help too. So we want to help them understand. So it's great to hear, from our audience.
Yeah, definitely drop in the comments or shoot us an email at hli@hli.org if you have any different encyclicals you'd like to hear about or specific things that we touched on today that you'd like to hear us talk more about. Please let us know because we want to give you content that you want to actually listen to and learn from. So
amen. Thank you, Colleen, very much for this time.
Thank you very much, Father. And to all of our audience, please let us know how we did. Let us know in the comments what you thought of this episode. And thank you for listening to our podcast and keep on living the culture of life. God bless.